Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiumEtSpiz22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I am extremely happy to have a very, very honored guest here today, someone who's been on the show once before, someone who I've known for many years now professionally. We're not exactly chums drinking beers and down at the local pub. We're on opposite ends of the world. But it's Dr. Tracey Rowland, who teaches at the University of Notre Dame in Australia. She's from down under. She's the John Paul II chair there. She's won the Ratzinger Prize, a very prestigious prize for theology. And she's reaching Matthew Levering levels of book production of late, cranking out a book a year or something or other. So welcome, Tracey, back to the
Thank
show.
you.
Dr. Rowland, it's really an honor to have you. We are 14 hours apart, so it's about 7 p.m. her time, and if I look a little blurry-eyed, I've got my Word on Fire sends out some nice swag, by the way, to their authors. So here we go. It's 5 a.m. my time, so if I'm a little blurry-eyed. Today we're going to be discussing Dr. Rowland's latest book, which I cannot recommend more highly in our current times. And I'll hold it up in a second for those viewing, but for those listening, it's simply called Unconformed to the Age, Essays in Catholic Ecclesiology. I'll repeat that. Unconformed to the Age, Essays in Catholic Ecclesiology. And for those viewing, it's a nice cover. There it is. I could put it in the program notes down below as well. So I would recommend everybody run, don't walk to your local whatever venue you used to order these things and to get this book. Not a huge book, eminently readable, broken down into bite-sized little chapters. I finished reading it last night over a nice bourbon, which is always good, and thought it excellent. So why don't you let's just begin with something simple, Dr. Rowland, Tracey. What prompted you? I always like to ask authors this. What's the motivation? What prompted you to write this book?
Well, I think that it all goes back to Matthew Levering. You mentioned Matthew before, and I
Yeah.
don't know how he produces the number of books he does. But occasionally I get these little emails from him making suggestions, and I'm always obedient. And he made this suggestion. And so I cobbled together, a number of different essays and sort of developed them from what they had been initially. And I think that I'm sort of one of these people who gets asked to write on some topic, and then that leads to another topic, and so on. It's not like I have a big master plan. I'm just always,
Yeah. You're not
sort of
Cyril
in the
O'Regan, all right, right? So
no,
who has the
no,
master plan, the big master
no.
plan?
No,
Yeah.
I'm a great admirer of Cyril, and I'm always waiting for, the next volume of his master plan to arrive, but I'm not like that. So.
I'm not either. Like I write for Catholic Report, National Catholic Register, and people say, "Why do you write so much on this?" Or that? I said, "It's because they ask me to."
Yeah,
So they suggest it to me. I said, "Okay, yeah, sure, I'll write on that. No big
yeah.
deal." But anyway, so and I
That's
don't have a
that's my
I
life
too
too.
I don't have a master plan either. But nevertheless, okay. So in this book, you are tackling various problems that you see in contemporary ecclesiology, in the theology
Yes.
of the church. And in particular, you attack what you view as the democratization of the church, the bureaucratization of the church, and in a sense those two things: bureaucratization, democratization. And
Yes.
maybe you could begin by, in a sense, what do you see as so problematic in this sort of isn't democracy a good thing? How come we don't need more democracy in the church and so on?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, I had 16 years working for the church on the payroll of the church, and working for a major metropolitan archdiocese. And it so often seemed to me that the pastoral work of the church was being completely thwarted by the bureaucracy. And when I would speak to other people who worked in similar places in other dioceses, they all said the same thing. Someone would come up with a great idea and then an accountant would say, no, we can't do that. Or a lawyer would say, oh, that's too risky, and
Yeah.
to actually engage in some kind of pastoral program, you've got to get it past the lawyers who want to have risk assessment analysis, and the apostles didn't have risk assessment analysis. They
Yeah.
just went out and preached the faith and served the people. And most of them got martyred, but that was okay, And I guess what I have observed, and it's not just in my country, but I think it's across the first world, uh, since the sort of mid-decades of the last century, there's been a vocations crisis, and we can analyse what gave rise to that vocations crisis. But following that, what the church has done is to employ a great many lay people in administrative positions. And so instead of having hospitals run by nuns, we now have hospitals run by lay people. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if those lay people really understand the faith and understand that there is a Christian way of relating to people and a non-Christian way of relating to people. And what has tended to happen in so many institutions is that the lay people who have been employed have not had a good faith formation themselves, and they rely on contemporary business management theory to run the institution. And you can say, well, of course you need budgets and you need accountants who can tell you how much money you have and who understand the taxation system and the government, regulatory systems. We need that, of course. But, so often I think instead of people encountering Christ in the life of our Catholic institutions, they just come up against a bureaucratic wall. And it's a major problem, I think, in the life of the church today. And it links with the democratization issue, because once you have democratization, you end up with a greater bureaucracy. The two are always related. And someone like Max Weber, the sociologist, noted that the Catholic Church runs, or did run, largely on charismatic authority, on a sense that people are put in positions because of their reputation for good judgment, because of their reputation for holiness, and this meant that they had a charism, which was the qualification which got them the job. But instead, we've moved from a charismatic understanding of ecclesial governance to something like what Weber would call a rational legal understanding, where the most important thing is your academic qualification. And very often that turns out to be, a master's in business administration.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
that's a problem. And so it was these kinds of issues that really are something I care about a great deal. And I see it in many places in the context of Catholic university life, where we have these institutions that are called Catholic institutions, but often we're simply paying for people to attack the faith from within those institutions.
Oh gosh, that last statement is so true. We're paying people to attack the very institution whose name is sort of tacked on to
Yeah.
the outwardness of. I mean, this is the most probably common lament I get from truly Catholic, professors at Catholic schools that, oh, my school really is just Catholic in name only. This has been a problem for 60 years, 70 years, despite Ex Corde Ecclesiae and so on. We could go down that rabbit hole at great length, but for our purposes here today, with regard to your book, it's indicative, of a broader problem within the church. I did a podcast yesterday with Rodney Hauser, my former colleague. You know Rodney as well.
Yes.
And what he was we were talking about Lumen Gentium, and we were talking about chapter 3 in the hierarchy, and he was making a point, and I think it's the point you're making here, that the problem with all of this emphasis on democratization in the church is precisely the linkage that you make between democratization and bureaucratization, and then to a third problem, secularization, which you
Yes.
kind of allude to here, the turning to secular models of marketing and governance and so on. And that actually the democratization of the church represents a lowering of accountability and a lessening of transparency, because you get these layered levels of plausible deniability, anonymity. I always say
Yes.
that the modern answering service for like a doctor's office or any company is a metaphor for our times, where you have to go through about 18 menus before
Yes.
clicking numbers before you can finally get to a human being, and you're just hoping that the call isn't dropped when they finally try to connect you to a human being. To me, that's a metaphor for what's going on in the church today.
Yes. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And when, the idea of a bureaucracy is that you take away the personal responsibility of the individual. So it becomes the committee that is responsible, not the individual members of the committee.
That's right.
So you can always hide behind a decision of a committee and say, well, that was a committee decision, and I can't tell you how I voted. That's a secret, but
Yeah.
it's a committee decision. And there's a lot of really excellent material by the philosopher Alistair McIntyre from the
Notre Dame.
University of Notre Dame, Indiana, on how what a bureaucracy does is to thwart the operation of prudential judgment. Okay, so you want to rid individuals of any ability to exercise their prudential judgment, and that takes away in part the degree of personal responsibility. When they can't exercise prudential judgment, they can always hide behind the protocols, and
Yes.
and there are, I think, people who truly believe that if you formulate the right protocols, you can make sure that there's no immoral behavior if you just come up with the right protocols. But I just don't think that's right. I think that it's always important to have people who are virtuous and wise and prudent, and that there's no kind of effective replacement for that.
Personnel is policy. Gute Leute muss man haben. Gute Leute.
Yes.
And
good people. Yeah.
Yes, good people. You have to have good people.
Yeah.
But that brings me, one of the things I was talking about with Hauser again yesterday, to sort of maybe piggyback on that conversation a bit, because it dovetails right into your book. And I don't necessarily want to drag you down into this rabbit hole, but as you were speaking, I was thinking, I just had an article come out in Catholic World Report a couple of weeks ago called, Rome Synodals While the World Burns, or that's the title Carl Olson gave it. And my point was, here we have all of these major crises, both in the world and in the church, involving the very things you're talking, secularization, unbelief, all these kinds of things. And the church has decided at this grave moment of human history that staring at its own navel and looking at its own internal bureaucratic apparatus is the most important issue of our time.
Yes.
So I'm not asking necessarily to go on a tirade against the Synod on Synodality as I have, but nevertheless, let's tie it into sort of ecclesiology and Vatican II. Vatican II, we were talking Lumen Gentium yesterday, famously promoted the idea of episcopal collegiality. And I'm going to bounce this idea of you and see what you say. Collegiality, of course, was an effort to raise the authority of the individual bishop vis-a-vis them. In other words, that the bishop's role to teach, govern, and sanctify comes directly from God in virtue of his consecration, and not by delegation from the papacy. And that elevated the authority of the local bishop vis-a-vis the pape. It wasn't a zero-sum game, and so it's still under and with Peter, but nevertheless. So how, I would say, in some ways, apropos of what you just said about committees, all right, a more synodal church, and Vatican II doesn't talk about synodality. It talks instead about collegiality. I would submit to you that synodalism is a way of creating bureaucracy that actually diminishes the authority of the individual bishop and thus is contrary to the collegial aspects of the council's teaching on the episcopacy. That's sort of my take. So I was wondering if what you think of my thesis there.
Yeah. I think two things. One is, after the council, all of these national bishops' conferences were created.
Yeah.
And I think initially people thought that that would be a good thing because they could actually look at the issues that were of national concern and not of international concern. The different countries have different issues. In Africa, polygamy is a problem. Well, it's not yet a problem in Australia. So we don't really need to have our bishops sitting around thinking about what to do about the problem of polygamy. So I can sort of understand the mentality behind the national bishops' conferences, but a point that Ratzinger makes, and I can't remember exactly where he makes it, but it's in my book somewhere, is that the problem with these national bishops' conferences is that, again, you end up with these documents that are the lowest common denominator documents. If you have 40 bishops in your country, you have a document that 40 people will agree to. And Ratzinger made the point that in Nazi Germany, it was individual heroic bishops who just stood up to Hitler. Not everyone did. There was just some who were heroes, and they said, not on my patch, in your dreams, you're not doing this. It's immoral, and they just put their lives on the line to do that. And so there's a problem with delegating a lot of authority to national bishops' conferences, because it means that the individual bishops who are likely to be the heroic ones are sort of pulled down by the ones who are not so heroic.
Yes.
And in any event, I've had experience of being on committees that draft documents, and I can tell you that the documents, my experience has been that the first drafts of the documents, which are done by the most talented individuals on the committee, are always better than what you end up with at the end when everyone's thrown in their 2 cents worth or 2 pence worth, or So that's one problem. How do we have our national bishops' conferences working so that they do make decisions about matters that only cover this or that country, but they don't take away the responsibility and the authority of the individual bishops to make their own decisions in their own diocese? Right. That's one problem. The other problem, again, Ratzinger referred to it, these ideas of having synods and having like the life of the church lurching from one synod to another. They were very popular in the 1970s. They were being promoted by German theologians in the 1970s. And Ratzinger actually talks about the idea of having a permanent synod, a kind of ongoing synod. And he says, look, all that will do, he said it will do two things. One thing is that it will create another level of bureaucracy in Rome. So for all of those people who complain about the Roman Curia, the establishment of a permanent synod would have the effect of simply creating another level of bureaucracy in Rome. And the other thing it would do is that those bishops who get appointed to that permanent synod would never be home. They would be what Pope Francis calls airport bishops. He has that phrase, airport bishops.
Airport bishops, yes.
And these poor people do end up spending an awful lot of time flying to Rome to sit on committees, and that's not how it's meant to be.
Well, you were, on a personal note, you were friends with the late, great Cardinal Pell, who was, obviously suffered and was in prison, but also when he wasn't being persecuted in jail, was frequently in Rome doing what did he think of having to be in Rome so much along those lines?
Yeah, look, I never had that conversation with him.
Okay.
I can remember at one time, John Allen, the journalist, said he didn't know of any position in Rome in the Curia for which Cardinal Pell had not been recommended or suggested as, the person to occupy that position.
Yeah.
He was a man who liked to travel. He loved going to the United States. He was a real fan of the American church, so-called, but he also loved going to the United Kingdom. He'd been a student at Oxford. He loved going to London. He had friends in the UK. I don't think he minded the travel, and I think he was a big picture person. He was someone who delegated the minutiae of administration to others, while he had the big ideas. But I think that he did at least try and make sure that the people who were implementing his big ideas agreed with him, and were not
Yeah.
just trying to thwart them.
Yeah. I just
So,
thought of him because I knew that you knew him,
yeah,
So,
yeah.
and if I were him, to continue, and we'll get back on topic. If I had been him after the experience of, the legal pogrom against him, I mean, the absolute person, I would have fled Australia and never returned, to be honest with you.
Yes, I can understand that. Look, I think one of the things about him was that I don't think he ever really, maybe only when a jury kind of convicted him at the magistrate's level, at the lowest level. I think only when that happened did he maybe start to think that the so-called common Australian person didn't have good judgment. But I think for much of his life, he had enormous confidence in the so-called common man's
Yeah.
judgment,
Yeah. Well,
and
it was
yeah.
just a very sad affair all the way around. But anyway, God bless his soul. And I pray for Cardinal Pell. I think he's a saint. But anyway, uh,
I
back,
think a
back.
lot of people agree. He gets many visitors to his grave. Many
Very good.
people coming to his grave to pray.
That makes me happy. I'm glad to hear that. But anyway, so to back to the you mentioned like what my viewers need to understand too is Dr. Rowland is an expert in the thought of Joseph Ratzinger, and has spent a lot of her career retrieving the thought of Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict. And I do know, if I recall correctly from reading the Peter Seewald biography, there were like these synods that were held in local synods held in Germany in the 1970s. And I remember Ratzinger had commented that the average German Catholic didn't seem to give a fig one way or the other for this. And Ratzinger says, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, he did, absolutely. And I think the same thing is happening now. Like
Mm-hmm.
in my parish, if I walked around saying to people, what do you think of the synod in Rome? They would say, what synod?
Yes.
You know. But Ratzinger said that there wasn't a lot of interest in the Synod of Würzburg, which occurred in Germany between 71 and, if my memory's right, 75. It was
Yeah.
certainly the first half of the decade of the 70s. And he just said that the people aren't interested because what they're interested in is their personal relationship with the Trinity. They are interested in their sacramental life, in their prayer life. And they want priests and bishops to foster that. And they couldn't care less about, whether you've got women sitting on boards of governance or, minority groups
Yeah.
sitting on boards of governance. And, that they just don't care. They just, when they go to a Catholic hospital, they just want to be treated kindly, and they want to know that no one's going to euthanize them. They don't care about
Yeah. Yeah.
what percentage of ethnic minorities are sitting on committees or whatever.
Yes. That, in your book, to bring it back to your book, I mean, you also talk about another problem in modern ecclesiology is the secularization of the church. And so, with taking it back to those German synods in the 70s and now the current process, since most average Catholics don't care about this, the question arises, why do so many bishops and theologians and other interested parties seem to care so much about synodality? And I was talking with George Weigel about this, and we both agreed that, it's because the synod and the synods in Germany, same thing, are a stalking horse for something else. Nobody really cares about the synod itself. It's a stalking horse for something else. And that something else is the changing of church teaching, especially in matters of human sexuality and so on, in a direction that is more in line with modern secularity. So maybe you could sort of comment on this. A huge problem in the church is this trend towards adopting the values of the secular world.
Yeah. Well, the church has always promoted a relationship between faith and reason. But yes, unfortunately, at the moment, what people think reason is largely driven by sociology, by the discipline of sociology, not by philosophy, not by metaphysics, certainly, but sociology. And a large percentage of social theory is completely atheistic. And the image of the human person that is implicit within contemporary social theory is, we're basically just like biochemical machines. There's no understanding of the human person as having a rational intellect with the capacity for truth, or a will with a capacity to pursue goodness. Not all of that is simply rejected in much contemporary social theory. And if you eliminate God from the understanding of the human person, then you end up with an understanding of freedom, which is a capacity to do whatever you like, and a capacity to make up your entire identity. So if you don't like who your parents are, you can just pretend that they aren't your parents. If you don't like the sex that you are, you can have a sex change operation. And you can treat sexual intimacy as some kind of leisure activity, and you can kind of enjoy the idea that there are, 70 different ways, or 72 different ways, according to Facebook, I think, of expressing your sexual self, your sexual identity. So if you eliminate God from the understanding of the human person, it has a massive effect upon notions of human dignity and freedom. And so, unfortunately, when people are baptized but not catechized, not given a proper Catholic intellectual formation, they tend to think of the Catholic Church as something like a club or a philanthropic association. And they think, well, it's completely behind the times because it isn't flying rainbow flags or something. And so they see that they have a kind of moral mission to drag the church kicking and screaming into the world we inhabit, where we all think, well, not all of us, but where so many people think that freedom means doing whatever I like. And in the book, I make the point that if you look at very wealthy countries like Germany, the church in those very wealthy countries tends to get a lot of government money for its philanthropic work, a lot of government money to run its hospitals, its welfare agencies, its schools in some circumstances. And so then you end up with this whole professional class. I understand that in Germany, it's something like 600,000 people employed by the Catholic Church in Germany.
Isn't it the second largest employer in Germany, I think?
I think it's certainly the largest private employer in Germany. Maybe the German government itself is a bigger employer.
That's what I said. I think the church is the second largest employer in Germany, behind only the government.
Yeah.
which is insane, right?
Yeah. And so you've got these thousands of people, they're not going to mass. We know that they are not going to mass because we can compare the statistics of mass going with, employment in the church. And, there's a problem that these people are on the payroll, but they haven't been given, for whatever reason, maybe it's not their fault. We don't know. We're not in a position to make those judgments, but we know that they don't have a Catholic intellectual formation.
No,
And
absolutely.
so the decisions they make are often contrary to church teaching. And then because of their very exalted position in some church agency, they then get invited to these synods. And then, we have the bizarre sort of situation of people who don't accept church teaching telling the church what it should be teaching. And another point I make in my book is that there are two documents of the International Theological Commission which look at this issue of the sensus fidelium, this notion that the lay people have an understanding of the faith, kind of implicit understanding of the faith. And in both of those documents, it says that there are criteria for discerning whether somebody, some member of the laity, does in fact have a sense of the faith.
Right, right.
And one of those criteria in both documents, including a 2018 document, say that if you don't accept magisterial teaching, well, this is like a kind of alarm signal that you probably really don't have a sense of the faith.
Yeah. That's why, with regard once again to the lead up to the synod, all these listening sessions, you saw many people in the popular media, the Massimo Fagiolis, Austin Ivories, these guys who were talking about how the church was listening to the sensus fidelium and all of these listening sessions. And so much of what was coming out of the listening sessions was just outright dissent from established church teaching. Of course, usually on matters of gender and sexuality and that kind of stuff. And I thought, well, this is really rather contrary. They're always talking about how all of this is the fulfillment of Vatican II, and yet the council, this is not the council's definition of the sensus fidelium. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. I think that at the council, there wasn't much of a they didn't,
No.
There's not a document which really goes into what is the sensus fidelium in any depth. To do that, you have to backtrack to Newman and read what Newman had to say about it, and then look at what people like Congar had to say about it. In many people's minds, Congar was one of the leading progressives at the Second Vatican Council. But if you read what he had to say about the sensus fidelium, and he was in favor of it, he did believe in it, but he said you have to be very careful that you don't just have people promoting the whatever happens to be the fashionable ideas of the times. And he was, very concerned about that.
Yeah. Of course, there are, in my mind, two Congars. There was the Congar leading up to the council, and then the later Congar, the Concilium Congar, that I think became a little bit more off the rails later in his career, but I could be wrong about that. I know his memoirs of Vatican II are endlessly fascinating, and I have profited from reading him. But anyway, back to your book. Another issue that you raise, and I thought this was really interesting, was the elevation of praxis over truth in a lot of modern.
Yes.
What's important is pastoral practice and how people actually live, and the category of lived experience far more important than doctrine and truth and so on. So maybe you could comment on what's going on there. What's this all about?
Yeah, well, it's one of the core ideas of liberation theology, and it comes directly from Marxism. I think it's important to understand that liberation theology is a German product.
Yes.
And in part a Belgian product, but it's a European product, largely Belgian and German. And what happened in the 1960s was that the intellectual elite of the Latin American countries were sent to Europe to do their doctorates. So you've got, priests being sent to Germany and to Belgium, to the University of Louvain, to Munich, to Bonn, to write their doctoral theses. And they are influenced by a generation of German theologians who come out of the Second Vatican Council and with this mentality of we have to be open to the world. And they look around and they think, well, who represents the world? And then at that moment in history, it was the Frankfurt School of Social Theory that was the biggest thing on the intellectual market. And so then you
Horkheimer
get
and Adorno and those guys.
Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse. And
Marcuse,
so
yes.
we get an engagement of Catholic theology with Frankfurt School social theory. And through that, there's the influence of Marxism. And the attitude becomes, look, maybe Marx was wrong about atheism, but maybe his social theory was okay. And there's this tendency to try and disconnect his atheism from the rest of his thought to make it sort of sanitized and acceptable of assimilation to Catholic theology. And one of the big concepts that gets taken on is this notion of the priority of praxis, that praxis is more important than logos. Okay. Now, there are two people who really strongly went to war against that. One is Romano Guardini, and the second person is Ratzinger. And Ratzinger, I think, picked it up from Guardini. It was Guardini who first went to war against this.
Interesting.
And Ratzinger, interestingly, in his work where he engages with Marxism, he says his primary problem with Marxism is not that it's atheistic. He does see that as a problem, but he thinks its primary problem is its attitude to truth, that there is in fact no truth. There's just pragmatism. You just look at what you want to achieve and then you come up with a rationalization to achieve that end.
Just
that's
myself.
What's happening to do.
Yeah, no, I remember when go ahead. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to bring it back to your point about moral theology and the sort of gender fluidity agenda. What's happening is that people want to affirm that agenda. They want to get the church to adopt that agenda, but to do that, they have to completely relativize or marginalize or overturn 2 centuries of tradition, 2 centuries of Christian teaching, and that 2 centuries of Christian teaching actually rests on the biblical framework from the Old Testament. So it goes back a whole lot longer than two centuries, but 2 millennia. So if I've been saying centuries, I should have been saying millennia. You have to completely flip the whole moral tradition, and you have to come up with an intellectual justification for that. And so you come up with this notion of the priority of praxis. And that's sort of what we're living through.
Lived experience. That's kind of a code for that. I'm sorry I interrupted you earlier. I just was reminiscing of the fact that when I was an undergraduate, I was reading, and I'm not bragging about this, I was just a nerd, but I was reading Das Kapital, and I remember that I was actually smitten a bit with its critique of capitalism. I still think Marx had a rather astute awareness of the problems of the capitalist system as it existed in his time, of course, and it has morphed and changed since then. But I remember thinking, well, okay, is this economic? But then I realized, holy cow, but he's wrong on just about everything else, in this. And so I do think one of the things I remember, I studied liberation theology at Fordham University in the early 90s when I was getting my doctorate. And it was really my first time of actually reading liberation theology. And I liked some of them, Gutierrez, and some others. But I remember thinking, especially reading Segundo, You look at their footnotes in the bibliography, and it was all German authors. And
Yeah.
here they were all in the books railing against Eurocentrism and Eurocentric theology and academic theology, and we need praxis-based theology and the base communities and so on. And you go and look at their list of theologians they're reading, for crying out loud, it's all German. All right.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's just crazy to think that this is really an indigenous theology that just grew up spontaneously out of South America when it didn't.
No, it didn't. It's just nonsense. It didn't.
Yeah, and of course you had then political theologies like Metz and so forth that were influential here as well. Uh, but along these lines, there's also, it seems to me, and it relates to ecclesiology, to bring this back to theology. There is a kind of theology of grace, a kind of runaway Rahnerianism, I call it, or Rahner on steroids. It's a degradation of Rahner's theology that so views the world as always already salvifically engraced everywhere that one loses the ability to adjudicate between truth and error in that world. You simply then become a sponge for absorbing. Furthermore, in your theology of revelation, you begin to equate the movement of the Holy Spirit in these always already engraced structures of the world as equally revelatory as that of the Old and New Testaments, as that of the church's tradition. And so it's another loci of revelation alongside, and we have to take that into consideration.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's a new form of Joachimism. Okay. So, Joachim of Fiore had this idea that, first we have a Christian moment, like a Christ-centered moment in history, and then we move forward to a moment in history which is dominated by the Holy Spirit. And this is completely new kind of moment. And when you have this sort of Joachimism popping up, you get a kind of cleavage between what Christ taught and what the Holy Spirit is allegedly teaching us in the contemporary world. And, this is a huge problem. And Balthasar talked about it as a problem. Congar talked about it as a problem.
Yeah.
And I think when you listen to what some of the people are saying about synodality, it's just straight Joachimism. It really is. It's like, well, Christ may have said, and then they, fill in some moral principle. Christ may have said this, but now we are more advanced and the Holy Spirit is trying to reveal something to us that is different from what
God is doing a new thing.
God is doing a new thing, and it's ridiculous because it means that there has to be some kind of disagreement within the Trinity itself, and that's just nonsense.
It is nonsense. And the trouble is that in these conversations that you get in with people who are advocates of that view, I mean, they're never quite so blunt as to say, well, we don't follow what Jesus says anymore. We follow promptings of the Spirit within us now, like sort of neo-enthusiasts, neo-Gnostic sort of enthusiasts. We're getting new illuminations. All that. They're never quite that. They're never. What they say instead is, hey, we're not fundamentalists. You can be a fundamentalist and a literalist if you want, but we have contextualized the words of Jesus in his time and place. So when he says you shouldn't get divorced and remarried, here's what he sort of really meant. And we've gone beyond that now, and so on. So there's this sense of rhetoric about fundamentalism that I think we have to overcome here as well. Don't you agree?
I think we do, and it's difficult to overcome because when these conversations take place, usually one gets quickly put into some kind of stereotypical box, and to get out of that box, you have to rely upon personal testimony of personal experience, to say, look, I'm not, what you are trying to make me out to be. And here's 3 reasons why I'm not, or here's, 3 pieces of evidence to prove that I'm not,
Yeah.
And so then we end up dragged into an argument where it's my personal experience that becomes the criterion to defend official church teaching, and that's a weak position to be in. The alternative position is to really say, look, I believe in truth, and things cannot both be and not be. They're either right or they're wrong, but they can't be both at the same time. And the idea that 2 + 2 can equal 5 in theology, which is something that was said by
Father Spadaro.
Father Spadaro, 2 + 2 can equal 5 in theology. If you start believing that, then really you've arrived at a point where you are saying, look, we make it up ourselves. And if we make it up ourselves, we're Gnostics. And why become a member of the church if, in fact, it has nothing to teach us?
That's right.
If we can simply,
well, and don't you think that's
generation recreate it?
It's a reason why people are walking away from the church. Let's say, for example, in Germany. Germany last year lost off the official rolls. I think it was 400,000 Catholics. Since 2019, 1.7 million German Catholics have disenrolled from the church. For those of you who don't know, the German church is supported by the church tax that the German government taxes its citizens to pay churches, and it's voluntary. You can unenroll from the church tax, but then at that point you're not really considered a Catholic or a Lutheran or whatever anymore. But over the past 5 years, the Catholic Church in Germany has lost 1.7 million adherents. Now, to listen to Georg Betzing, the chairman of the Bishops' Conference, in commenting on this fact, he says, well, this is just further evidence that we need more and more and more of this synodal way. And I would argue that this is doubling down on a failed experiment. To go along with what you just said, why would people want to pursue or be a member of a church that has essentially waved the white flag and says, hey, we're just like you seculars? Well, then why go to church? Why go to church?
Yeah, exactly. One interesting thing I've dug up is there was a priest called Karl Forster, who I think a Monsignor, who actually organized the Synod of Würzburg. And he was initially a true believer in, democratizing the ecclesial governance structures. And he was the first person to come up with the idea of sending out thousands of questionnaires to thousands of German Catholics, asking them what they thought about this and that. But apparently, I found this article in the German edition of the Communio Journal, which just talks about Monsignor Forster and how his attitude to the whole process changed in the course of the Synod of Würzburg. And in the end, he started coming to a position which sounds like the position of Joseph Ratzinger. This just creates bureaucracy, and it's kind of chaotic, and the people who are the faithful people are not interested in it, and it's a waste of money and doing nothing to evangelize the world.
Yeah, I mean, this popular image that they like to promote of this is just promoting a sort of boots on the ground listening church of popular Catholic. It's just false. All you get are these self-selected busybodies, ecclesial busybodies, who show up to ride their own private hobby horses, and it just creates bureaucracy. But I want to go back to Ratzinger. I was just having a conversation with a theologian friend of mine the other day, Michael Hanby. Michael Hanby.
I know Michael.
Who said that really the great project of our times is the retrieval of Joseph Ratzinger's theology. And in many, many ways, I'm sure you agree with that. But yes. I want to go back to this crisis of truth. And this was so central to Ratzinger. And a document that he penned while head of the CDF, Dominus Jesus. I can't remember what year it came out. Maybe you would know.
2000, I think.
2000, okay.
I'm pretty sure it was 2000.
Yeah, it was later in the papacy of John Paul II that it came out. But he says in there, all right, that one of the gravest crises facing the church today is this very notion that has crept in. It goes along the lines of everything you were talking about this sort of quasi-Gnostic and Joachimite approach to things. Ratzinger says one of the gravest crises is by theologians themselves is the denial of the very possibility of an absolute revelation of God in time and history. This notion that there can, I mean, it's really out of the Enlightenment, that the eternal truths of the infinite cannot be expressed in the contingent truths of history, that by necessity, anything that is historically mediated is partial and in need of further completion, and so on. And so he hits this idea. And I think this is now part and parcel of all of the current agitations, that the Spirit is doing a new thing because what the old thing was could not possibly become. In other words, so it's not simply let's marginalize Jesus and move on to something else. It is Jesus himself was partial. This is not an absolute manifestation. He who sees me sees the Father. Yeah. Not really. I think that's a fundamental crisis going on here.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think Ratzinger addresses that in Introduction to Christianity. So what you described is, in academic parlance, Lessing's great ugly ditch. The idea, there's this ditch between history and metaphysics, and or history and philosophy, and the Enlightenment is all about philosophy, and history is something subjective and unreliable, and Ratzinger goes to war against that, and he loves that phrase, to see the whole in the fragment, and he says the only way human beings can really see the whole is in the fragment, and so revelation had to be historical. Christ didn't arrive with a library full of books and say, if you read all of this and can, digest it, you will have the truth. No, he says, I am the truth, I am the way. And that's really, really quite important. And for Ratzinger, it's not only Christ who we can't kind of contextualize, but he thinks that Christ established the church according to a particular pattern. And, if you just go to the catechism and look up bishops, you see the analogy with the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel, and you have this whole notion of the church, based upon the Old Testament. And for Ratzinger, we can't mess with this. It's not ours to mess with. It's a gift that's been given. And we just have to be the holiest possible people we can be, so that whatever authority we have, we won't misuse.
Yeah.
And I once compiled a whole page of statements from Ratzinger where he says what we need is more holiness, less bureaucracy. And I think he's absolutely right. But more than that, getting back to Hanby's idea about needing to retrieve Ratzinger's theology, I think that if you read the collected works of Ratzinger, what you get is a kind of masterclass in fundamental theology. Because what he did for most of his academic life was to address hotspots. So he didn't have the luxury of just thinking, well, what's my big project going to be? And I'll take 3 decades to
no master plan.
No master plan. No.
He was a theological fire jumper where he just jumped into the hotspots.
He just had to jump into the hotspots. And what he does in every case is to say, like, he will look at what he perceives to be the wrong approach, explain where it comes from, give it its best hearing, and then say, but this is how, and this is the way it should be. And so you can piece together a whole fundamental theology of Ratzinger. And I sometimes talk about it in terms of there being critical couplets like nature, grace, faith, reason, scripture, tradition, Petrine office and episcopacy, history and ontology, dogma and history, or whatever. You've got all of these critical couplets which are building blocks which form the foundation of Catholic theology. And in almost every one of those foundations, there's a civil war going on. You know, if you go into a Catholic academy, you will find that there's no agreement on how nature is related to grace, or how faith is related to reason, or how history is related to ontology. So I think, you know, what Ratzinger gives us is a kind of blueprint. And it's not, with Ratzinger, you don't just get Ratzinger, you get Ratzinger and Newman, Guardini, you get Thomas Aquinas, you get
the Church Fathers,
Bonaventure, the great 19th century German theologian. So, you know, he was a man who really did have a panoramic vision of the whole Catholic intellectual tradition. And it's not just, you know, Joseph Ratzinger. Joseph Ratzinger is kind of cipher for the whole tradition.
Very much so, yeah.
I think that's why he's important. And well, there's an awful lot of nonsense going on all over the place. I just say to young people, look, just don't worry. You know, there's this English meme, keep calm and carry on. And I say, just keep calm and read Ratzinger. You know, and Ratzinger will lead you to other good people. Like you know, I'm not saying just be blinkered and just only read Ratzinger, but Ratzinger will lead you to all the great.
Well, he's the gateway, you know, like people all know that I'm a Balthasar scholar, that at least I began as a Balthasar scholar. And so who should I read and what should I read in Balthasar? And I'll say, well, start with Ratzinger, you know, because Balthasar is like a dense thicket that you have to know all about German idealism and all this kind of, it's just like, wow, where do I even begin? But Ratzinger, Ratzinger is just so clear, so concise, and yet also is navigating that same thicket of ideas. And I think that Ratzinger is a better gateway into ressourcement theologie, communio theology, than in some ways Balthasar, because Balthasar can be a bit esoteric and idiosyncratic, whereas Ratzinger really does open you up to this entirety. I'm going to go back to something you said, we'll move on after this, you know, once again about truth, where you said Jesus didn't show up with this whole library of books, right? That his revelation, that the revelation of God in Christ is inherently historical, and that contains a didactic element. Obviously, Jesus did leave us teachings that contain truths, but this was not in many ways the central act, if you will, event of the incarnation. And so immediately you see the heresy arises of Gnosticism. And immediately what the Gnostics want to do is to turn Jesus into some sort of Cracker Barrel dispenser of Cracker Barrel Gnosticist philosophies and so statements, you know, sayings of Jesus. And so my point is that when you get to the Second Vatican Council, of which Ratzinger obviously was an important peritus, you see the council trying to, in a sense, re-emphasize salvation history. That, in other words, yes, there's a propositional element to magisterial teaching, but we cannot reduce revelation, we cannot reduce the church to simply a set of deductive propositions, which had happened somewhat. You don't want to engage in caricatures, but it happened somewhat. And so the council comes along and says, we need to renegotiate Christian revelation by re-understanding it as this salvation historical thing. And I know Ratzinger was very interested in that project. So I don't mean to take you too far. Maybe you could comment on that a bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're talking about is the theology of De Verbum. And, you know, I think if people read De Verbum, that you know, it's really a great document. And it does present the idea that Christ is the revelation of God the Father to humanity, and that from this flows ecclesial tradition and the scriptures. And we don't want to abandon them, you know. So, okay, before the council, the caricature and from testimonies I've heard, it seems that in many cases people did sort of think of being a Catholic as being able to recite a whole lot of doctrines and follow them, and that the downside of this was that their personal spirituality was sometimes neglected. Their personal relationship with Christ was sometimes neglected, and they simply thought of themselves as having to obey various rules and regulations. And then Dave Urban becomes a corrective for that. But it's almost as though we've flipped to the other extreme now, where we're quite prepared to accept that revelation was something historical, but we want to disconnect it from scripture and ecclesial tradition.
Yeah. This is why I bring this up, Tracey. I don't want to leave the viewers with the impression, as we're discussing your book, we're talking about the crisis of truth, that your book is proposing as an antidote simply a return to old-fashioned kind of propositional deductive manual kind of, these are the truths, damn it, and let's stick with these. And no. There is this subtle like you said, das Ganze fragment, the whole, you have to see the hole in the fragment. The trick is, and I think the ressourcement guys do this very well, the trick is to see the timeless truths, to get over Lessing's ditch, to see those timeless truths precisely expressed in and through the contingency of history.
Yes.
That's the trick. That's the art of Catholic theology, right?
That is, yeah, you've nailed it. That's absolutely what it's about. And I had another thought as you were speaking. Oh, yes. An idea that I really like this idea, and I've mentioned it in the book, is Balthasar's suggestion that the church tends to rest on 4 pillars or 4 charisms. And he calls these the Petrine, the Pauline, the Johannine, and the Jacobine. And so his notion is that surrounding Christ in his earthly life, there were different characters.
The Christological constellation, he calls it.
Christological constellation. And that these types actually represent different charisms in the life of the church. So the Petrine charism is about ecclesial governance. And so the Petrine office is the great exemplar of that charism. The Pauline charism is really about being, prophetically aware of the pastoral needs of the people in a certain place and time. So the Pauline approach, or the Pauline charism, is you take the truth and you look at the conditions that people are living in, and you think, let's say it's colonial Canada, or there are all of these little Catholic children in Quebec, they need schools, and so the Pauline types are those who founded religious orders to go and live in snowbound villages teaching little children the faith. That's very Pauline.
Yeah.
So the Pauline is sort of associated with new ecclesial movements, with apostolic works. And then you get the Johannine, and I think of the Benedictine monks as typical of the Johannine. These are the contemplatives in the life of the church, the Carmelites, the Benedictines, the people who spend most of their time praying and doing penance. They're the contemplatives, the Johannine types.
That's right.
And then you get the Jacobine types. Now, their job is to know what the tradition is and to be able to intellectually defend it and develop it. So that's the scholarly charism in the life of the church. Now, I think the point that Balthasar makes is that you've got these 4 pillars, and they need to work together. They need to be integrated, and they need to be working in unison. But if any one of the 4 or more is weak, then the church suffers, and you can end up with a crisis. And in different times in the church's history, different pillars can be weak. And I think at the moment, the Jacobine one is really weak. It's very, very weak. And it's even under attack. It's not just weak, but it's under attack. So I'd make that point. And, in apropos your comments about, how I'm not suggesting we retreat to some kind of pre-de verbum intellectual universe. I think that many people either have this very strong pyramidal sort of approach or vision of the church with the Pope at the top, and then the bishops as the kind of CEOs beneath the Pope and so on, and the people, the sheep at the bottom. There's that view, and then there's this contemporary, let's democratize everything and just, vote for our parish priest, and, maybe priests will just agree to be priests for, say, 5 or 10 years, and it's like joining the army, and you have a commission and you get the commission from the local community, and they say, well, we'll have you for 5 years, and and then after 5 years you might think, I don't want to do this anymore, so you'll go and get married, and there's this sort of model of the church. But I think what Balthasar and Ratzinger and de Lubac and people who were really focused on the notion of the church as the mystical body of Christ, and who therefore were really interested in the sacramental relationships within the church, their vision is much more multidimensional, and it requires these 4 different charisms to be working together in tandem. And I think I think that's a good way to look at it.
That's a great way to put it. And I wanted to end on a more positive note. So I'm glad that in other words, I don't want to leave the review. I want people to buy this book, and I want people to read it because it's really excellent. And I don't want to leave people with the impression that all the book is a series of criticisms, of what you think is wrong with everything, because it's not that. There's a positive proposal in here as well. It's very much apropos of how you describe Ratzinger, right? You're flying into a hot spot. You're saying, you're giving it a fair hearing, but here's what's wrong. But here's the proposal. So along those lines, one of the things we haven't talked about yet, and we're sort of running out of time, but one of the things you talk about too is the removal of the element of the cross from our ecclesiology today. So maybe we could end by you talking a little bit about what you mean by the eclipsing of sort of the cross in our theology, and how that relates then to this positive proposal for a communio ecclesiology.
Yeah, well, I think that St. Paul talked about the battle against the powers and the principalities. He talked about a cosmic battle.
Yeah.
And Christian life for him was not able to escape that battle. Every Christian for St. Paul was someone who had been born into that battle. And I think that today people don't want to acknowledge that there is a battle, that there are bad spiritual forces at work. They don't want to acknowledge that because they think it sounds maybe non-intellectual, sort of pre-modern,
mythic.
And because they downplay that, they don't really know what to make of the cross. Why did Christ have to die on a cross? Why did he do it? And I think the cross, if you don't accept that there is a battle between good and evil, the cross doesn't make much sense. And
no theodrama, no cross.
There's no theodrama, no theodrama. And if you don't have a theodrama, the cross doesn't make sense. And so there's a tendency to occlude the cross, just not to talk about it, And apart from Good Friday, it doesn't seem to get on the radar screen of theological discussion. And that I think is is part of the problem, and it's certainly a big part of the problem of catechesis, because the cross is a pretty scary thing to confront. And I think in a lot of our Catholic schools, we don't confront it. We talk a lot about social justice. We talk a lot about being kind and inclusive. And of course, we do want to be kind. But, the cross is something that is confronting. And Gottlieb Söhngen, one of the early 20th century German theologians, he talks about there being different types of humanism. He says there's a classical humanism, a Christian humanism, and that Christian humanism actually built upon classical humanism. So those two humanisms are friends. There's a relationship between them that's very strong. When you get to the 18th century, there's a new humanism. And what that humanism wants to do is to drop the cross, And then we get finally to someone like Nietzsche, and we get yet another form of humanism, but it also has an affinity with the humanism of the 18th century. And for both of these humanisms, the cross is something that is a stumbling block. And interestingly, the German Jesuit theologian Erich Schwara, he actually has a theory that poor Nietzsche was in some ways kind of attracted to the cross because there's something awfully heroic about the cross. And Schwara says that Nietzsche just needed to discover Ignatius of Loyola. And he would have, instead of having an experience of Christianity, which was some form of German pietism, he needed a kind of full-bodied masculinity, full-bodied military heroism of Ignatius of Loyola, and maybe that could have converted him.
Imagine a world in which Nietzsche had become a Jesuit.
Exactly.
I mean, a Jesuit in the good sense. I mean, I can see the emails I'm going to get now. You're like, oh, weren't the Jesuits all Nietzscheites anyway? No, you missed the point. But that'd be great because, Nietzsche pits Dionysius against Christ, right? And it's because he views Dionysius as the more sort of ur person, the Ubermenschen, that's filled with life and vitality and exuberance and all that kind of stuff. Whereas Christ represents milquetoast, slave morality, kind of stuff. So I that's great. I did not know Schwara had said that. So that's a nice little nugget there. Well, we're sort of, I like to keep my podcast around an hour and 15 or so. I don't like them to go on too long. Is there anything I've sort of left out or that we've left out in the analysis of your book, the promotion of your book that you want to, before we leave, that you want to bring up?
I would simply say that there is a chapter on synodality. And what I tried to do, and what I tried to do there was to say, look, there is such a thing as the sense of the faith. Newman had some great ideas, and synods have been happening in the life of the church for centuries, but not according to the current form. And so what I tried to do in that chapter was to propose what a synod based on Newman's theology might look like, contrasted with, the hodgepodge that's been happening more recently. So people might find that interesting. Yeah.
It's actually the first chapter I read. When I saw the title heading, I thought, well, I'll be in Rome all October covering the synod. I want to see what Tracey has to say about synod. So how could I have not brought that up? Part of me is because I kind of want to avoid turning every conversation I have with every person on here into an endless conversation about synodality. And yet it is the issue of the moment. I mean, it's the ultimate project of the current papacy. And so it is important to talk about. And your chapter does sort of propose Newman. What would Newman think of synodality today?
Well, what would Newman think of it? Well, he would certainly think that it's bizarre that you might have people turning up to talk about their feelings and their life experience who are actually attacking centuries of churches' moral teaching. He would find that completely bizarre, I think.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of us find it completely bizarre. But anyway, on that note, unless there's any last words before we sign off here, Tracey, well, thank you for joining me from down under. It's now 10 after 8 o'clock p.m. your time, I believe. So I don't know what time you go to bed, but that would be approaching bedtime for me because.
Well, no, I'm not up at 4 a.m. So no,
Yeah, I
my
usually.
bedtime's more like in about 2 or 3 hours time.
Well, great. Yeah, I'm a morning person. But anyway, I can't thank you enough for coming on. But more importantly, I can't thank you enough for writing this book, Unconformed to the Age, Essays in Catholic Ecclesiology. People always write to me, what can you recommend that I read? If you're interested in issues in modern Catholic ecclesiology, this is a great book. There's a lot of books out there. This is a great book, very accessible. So thank you, Tracey, for writing. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Larry. God bless.
God bless you too.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye.